Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have the invitation to present. My name is Dsi Jam. I'm from Dark Matter Labs. Um, I think what you're about to discuss is a really important issue and a structural issue. Um, I think our relationship, our understanding of civics and civil society needs radical transformation. And I suppose I would like to make a contribution, both myself and Fang, on what this could be and what this could look like. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to explain where some of our thinking's at Dark Matter Labs and where the journey we've been on as a mechanism to maybe show or articulate a way forward. So with that, firstly, thank you. And I'm going to just switch to screen sharing and share some of the kind of slides and bring some of this conversation together. So I suppose what we want to present is an idea of radical civics, and actually unconstituting our theory of society as it's been put together between the kind of dichotomy of the state and the market. And increasingly, you've seen David Graeber's brilliant work on The Dawn of Everything started to show that civilization hasn't always been a function of the state as we understand it. Civilization has been a function of civil societies, and complex civilizations have been a function of civil society. And I think there's an important moment to herald a new way of organizing and a new way of organizing civilization, which goes beyond the kind of simplistic theories of state and monopolies of violence. This work that we're presenting respectfully has been part of a long journey. I was part of building the Bristol Urban Beach in 2007, all the way through to actually building Civic Systems Lab with Tessie Britton, to building multiple impact hubs, which were looking at civil society-led change, whether it's Birmingham or other places, Impact Hub Birmingham. And also we've been building WikiHouse, open source housing, Open Desk, open source furniture company. We've been operating in the idea of civic space for a while. We actually wrote the Compendium for the Civic Economy, myself, Joost, various other people, looking in 2010-11, actually what could this civil society look like and where were the kind of early examples of it. We were fortunate to be enough to put that book together, and it was forwarded by the Prime Minister. So this has been a long journey of both practice and research and part of that journey. Now I want to intro this conversation in a slightly different way, which is I want to put forth to you that actually a new type of civics is already being born. Whether it's a river that's gaining legal personhood, or a lake, or the constitutional rights of nature in Ecuador, or in the United States, I think a new type of civicness has been born. This is a civicness where everything is a civic agent, and everything becomes self-sovereign in itself, or self-owning in itself. And that changes our relationship with each other. And what that sits on is an idea that actually the world that we've constructed has been constructed through a theory of ownership. Ownership is the enslavement of one thing for the needs of the other. That it creates a single point optimization model of governance. Whereas actually in a complex emergent world, we need to move from ownership to a genuinely civic relationship with everything, which recognizes that everything is entangled and has multi-point optimizations. Now, in that worldview, the reason why the river becomes self-sovereign is important is it's impossible for it to be centrally managed and understood. It needs to have its co-beneficiary relationships in dynamic interactions need to be respected and evolved continuously. So in this worldview, we're moving from a human-centric owned world to actually everything being civic, everything around us having its own self-ownership, and thereby us being in treaty and relationship with that world. And that can be exemplified by everything. The reason why this is critical is that everything is entangled. Whether it's a house, you can understand the value of a house through its sale value, its use value, but also through its impacts on climate impacts, its carbon impacts, its waste economy, all the way through to energy contributions, to the biodiversity impacts, health outcomes. So when you start to see the house not as a discrete thing, but as an entangled thing, we have to start to have a new relationship a relationship which is fundamentally different, which is, I think, part of a kind of a relatively radical theory of civics, which I think needs to be incorporated. And this is a growing manifestation. This idea that I put there pretty much affects everything. This kind of embodied relationship, the spillover relationships, and the intangible relationships, and how these manifest. And I want to start this conversation by saying, if we start to look at it through that lens, we start to actually think about the world through a different stack, which is the role of radical civics is actually about recognizing everything has its own civic self-sovereignty. And we have to create the deep code and institutional infrastructures to preserve that. And actually, we have to create a new type of relationship between each other, be able to drive that. And state and private sector, which sit on top of that, are actually agents of optimization that sit way on top of that, as a sort of almost, the root is a civic root, and everything else is a secondary framework. So when we start to look at that, what becomes very clear is when everything is self-owning, the relationship is a reciprocal relationship. So the relationship between things has to be reciprocal. Value has to be understood through a systems lens. You can't understand the value of the house just in its use value, because that single point optimization destroys and mitigates and constructs challenges for everything else. You have to understand and hold things in uncertainty. I cannot be certain of my impacts with each other, so I have to hold things in care. Our theory of identity cannot be static and singular, but actually evolving and relational. And this requires real common infrastructures to be able to actually build some of these capabilities and protocols and infrastructures. We have to recognize the democracy of agency and democracy of everything. The power has to be decentralized radically, both in a human and a non-human sense. Everything is a citizen in this world. So when we start to take this worldview, we start to see a different way of organizing, which is, I think, critical, and requires deep code innovations. And deep code innovations that go at the heart of understanding finance and governance, because it's not enough to imagine it through a singular sense. This cannot be resolved only in the kind of theory of ownership and theory of transcending the theory of property and being in relationship with. It requires us to actually build new accounting infrastructures, recognize new models of currency. We have to decentralize and distribute our theory of money formation. We have to recognize that everything exists in a many-to-many relationship. And in that moment, how do you contract? What is a contract of care, which is not a contract of extraction? How do you build actually the frameworks for relational self-sovereignty or self-ownership? So, which isn't fundamentally governed by the state or held by the state, but actually is perhaps on registries like blockchain registries, which create actually a commoning engine of that framework. How do you build a legal infrastructure, which is about lawing and iteration, radical iteration, which is where sort of common law came for? What does that look like in the 21st century? And how do you build this common-centric institutions? So in order to deliver what we talked about above, requires us to actually challenge and innovate the deep code innovations of society. And that, when you stack this up, the radical civics at the kind of base of kind of a worldview, actually requires some of these deep code innovations that allows us to deploy principles into the real world and thereby creates new economies and ways of organizing society. Now, what I've started to speak about is actually just the beginning of the story, because in a sense, that creates the frameworks for us to explain and reimagine our relationship and our things in the world. Whether it's a house, so how is a house self-sovereign, to actually whether a forest, an urban forest, could be self-sovereign and self-owning, and how does it operationalize itself? So how would a forest, which remember the value of a forest is not timber, the value of a forest is multiplous and continuously evolving. How do you support a forest being self-owning? How do you support its recognition to multiple beneficiaries and common-centric beneficiaries rather than single-agent beneficiaries? How do you build relationships of care? How do you build the legal infrastructure to be able to put this together? How do you actually associate which are monetary economies and gift economies in new ways? So how do you recognize the gift of somebody coming in and actually supporting the composting into that, planting foods and planting other things. How do you build a new type of economy which is based on gift and recognition as opposed to just monetary sides? And when is the monetary side relevant? So at a macro level, maybe the monetary side is relevant. So how do these new economies intersect? And how do these economies come together with new frameworks of accounting and even new theories of money, which I think we're doing a lot of work around, sort of new theories of decentralized distributed money production, but from a civic sense. We know Bitcoin creates some of these capabilities, but actually Bitcoin has some regressive functions, which are all about the concentration of wealth. In the original, it concentrates wealth. It actually makes pristine assets, which are untangled or which are untangled for the world, which actually provides hoarding infrastructure. So how do we reinvent some of those things in a harder way? And then how do these, as I said, how do these coexist in new formats, the gift economy, the market economy, the welfare economy, to create new forms of value in this theory? And this also applies to theories of a house. We're working on a free house right now, which is a house that owns itself. And the purpose is that actually you don't own a house, you don't rent it, you become in treaty with the house. And the house is actually what that does in economic terms is massively over time reduce the cost of the house because everyone isn't taking equity out of the house. So it becomes actually a genuine civic good. A civic good with many-to-many agreements, many-to-many outcomes. As we said earlier, the house is not just about human living, optimizing a theory of human living, but it actually has a multiplicity of benefits. How do you construct those contracts? How do you build those contracts in really open, radically transparent ways? And these beneficiaries and spillovers are really critical in understanding the value of this story. So what I'm trying to present here is effectively a new theory of things, new theory of the world around us, whether it's the river, the forest, or the house, and could be the autonomous car itself. That actually, when we start to see the world through a civic lens, where everything is self-owning, but everything is actually co-beneficiaries, it changes our relationship with things. We cannot be single point optimizing to ourselves. We have to actually be in relationship with it, have to be in a relationship of care, recognizing that our relationship might have negative implications for other relationships. This is a fundamental transition, a root level transition. And this requires new theories of identity, new theories of relationship to land, new theories of money. But it actually fundamentally also requires a transformation in who we think we are and our relationship to the world. An idea that transcends the theory of us owning the world, but actually genuinely being in care and treaty with the world. And that is not only, I think, a necessity, but I think will be critical for the transition. It's a necessity because in an age of complexity, it is very, very difficult to actually drive single point optimization. In fact, I would argue that actually part of the reasons that we have the challenges that we have is that in reality, one of the reasons we have challenges that we have is we have lived in a single point optimizing world. And that single point optimization has meant that actually we've created huge externalities. And climate change and plastic pollution are a framework of these externalities. And it's not possible from a single point optics. If you only see the forest, the value of timber, then you will always single point optimize. So in order to make the radical transition that's required, we have to change our relationship with the world at a deep code level. And we have to recognize actually everything and the agency of everything in a co-beneficiary world. And that to me is a radical civics, and a radical civics that changes fundamentally everything around us. I'm really honored and delighted to have the opportunity to present and share some of these ideas with you. I really look forward to seeing what you do with them and how you can make them better. I don't claim this to be the truth, neither do we, but actually as a contribution to the debate that's ongoing. So with that, I sincerely thank you for your time and attention. Kind regards, Indy.